this panel is entitled Updating a Zoning Ordinance with Smart Growth Principles.
I'm really thrilled to be here to talk about smart growth. It's a topic I am really passionate about as a land use planner, and it's great to see several of my colleagues as planners here in the room today. I'm going to start with a confession in that this is my first time to Arlington, and this presentation doesn't have many photos from southeastern Vermont. So you're going to see a lot of pictures that tend to favor northwest Vermont. I live in Berry City and work in Montpelier, and I'm Jacob Hemmerick. I'm a planning policy manager in the Department of Housing and Community Development, working with Commissioner Hanford and an outstanding team pictured here, where we work to provide tools, trainings, grants, and incentives to support thriving and prosperous communities. And we have a soft spot for old buildings, and Representative Bongartz said this is the first time this old building has been occupied in 12 years. So it's great to be in a building like this today to talk about kind of the broader picture of what is smart growth and how can smart growth support housing in the state. And at the heart of smart growth is the concept of really being thoughtful about where and how we build, and that means being thoughtful to neighbors, to ecosystems, and really thinking about the government services it takes to provide and support that housing. And making smart growth happens really takes a commitment by private and public partners working together to create development-ready places. And modern market forces haven't always, and regulatory regimes and public subsidies, they haven't always been consistently kind to some of the smart growth locations and some of the most economically productive places, like this picture of Bristol, Vermont in 1982. It has really taken a lot of elbow grease to save places we already have and to steer new growth to long-term win. And that elbow grease has really paid off. I mean, this is Bristol today, and it's because Vermont's leaders over the years have prioritized smart growth, vitality, and adaptation in downtowns. Next slide. In our village centers, our historic village centers. Next slide. And neighborhoods around downtowns and villages where jobs, housing, entertainment, and school, shopping all exist close together, making them some of the most convenient places in the state. So it's taken a lot of work to make these centers livable, and studies consistently show that smart growth is good for the energy efficiency, it's good for the environment, it's good for the economy, and that includes household budgets for the people that live in those smart growth centers, as well as the tax bills that the people living there face. Not only is smart growth wisdom from the centuries of human settlement, but it's also a Vermont tradition, and it's embodied in our planning acts, foremost goals to plan settlement so as to maintain the historic settlement pattern of compact village and urban centers surrounded by rural countryside. This goal in our modern planning framework mostly came about because of thinking that happened in the 1960s. There were many things happening. IBM came, the interstate was coming, resort development was occurring, and the leadership of the state at that time realized they were kind of at Robert Frost's proverbial two paths in a wood. And they feared a scenario where much of the state would be consumed by sprawling development. And this is kind of the vision of what they thought 1990 would look like if the state didn't make changes back in the 1960s. So a planning council wrote really a bold document called Vision and Choice, and its preface was titled Rejecting the Inevitable. And I read that preface yesterday, and it echoes so many of the parts of today, so many of the concerns today about some of the influx from people from every direction of the state, the need to keep our youth and welcome new citizens, environmental deterioration, undesirable consequences of growth, and some of the economic and social influences tearing at the seams of the national fabric. So if you have a chance to pull up that document, it's a great read. So that document really set the table for the planning framework we work with today. And it wasn't fully adopted, but the Act has stood the test of time, and it's built this platform coordinated framework based on statewide goals, required regional plans. It made municipal planning optional, but said if you're going to regulate, you need to adopt a plan. Throughout the planning framework, we see a lot of prioritization for housing, and there's a statewide housing goal, there are regional housing plan elements, there are local plan housing elements, and then there's this section on municipal bylaw protections, and that includes things like Leslie Blacklow talked about for accessory dwelling units, our supportive housing, our care homes, and Jim's going to talk a little bit about efforts in Bennington County after me about how do we take some of the many goals that we have in our regional plans, state plans, local plans, and move them into implementation and into local bylaws to welcome more housing. Among the thoughtful mile markers for planning in Vermont was the adoption of smart growth principles. And so that's what I've been invited here today to talk about. They came into Vermont law in 2006 under Act 183. And it's a platform really for considering well-located housing, and it begins with the foremost primary goal, compact settlement. And that could be infill housing in existing villages, but it could also be new development. And so this is an example of Heinsberg at the northern edge of their village center. Unfortunately, most studies that we look at indicate that Vermont is losing ground when it comes to this goal. 83% of residential growth has occurred outside compact centers. And this was a mapping exercise that didn't just look at designated centers. It wasn't just designated downtowns or designated village centers. It was a mapping exercise that went beyond those to kind of say where are compact area settlements in the state and how much development is occurring in those areas. The second principle of smart growth is that it developed mixed-use centers at a scale appropriate to the community and region. And mixed-use centers and buildings tend to be really economically productive. And as a community, you only have so much land, right? And so smart growth is about choosing which development crops, if you want to use the analogy of a farmer, that makes sense and offer the best return on a public investment like streets or sidewalks. And that's really the function of all local zoning ordinances. So you can see a big box store in St. J, 25 acres, valued at about $4 million. Its value per acre is about $200,000. My house here in Berry City on 0.41 acres, it's about $500,000 per acre. You look at a mixed-use building in White River Junction on a half acre, there are 22 units valued at $1 million. But when you take that on a value per acre basis, you're seeing that you're getting $2.9 million. This math has kind of changed some of the housing conversation, and it's enabled housing ambassadors to talk about the value of compact development and multi-unit housing within communities throughout the state. Another principle of smart growth is that it enables choices of transportation, places that can support bus transit, bikes, walking. In my community, 13% of households don't have a car. This is a key equity consideration for some communities throughout the state. Another principle is the protection of natural resources. And that includes important environmental, historic, natural areas, water quality, scenic resources, historic sites, districts. This is downtown St. Albans, where they're planning to welcome housing by looking at district-based stormwater and putting green stormwater infrastructure in their downtown. And that allows them to build more housing, create infill that might otherwise require on-site stormwater system and push development apart instead of bringing it together. And if you just were to compare, two patterns of development here, we have on the one hand, kind of low-density rural residential can support 5 people and 2.23 jobs outside of a compact settlement. That's per acre. Inside, you can see that the same amount of impervious surface would support 12 people and 10.67 jobs per acre. So we can often look at these compact centers and say, oh, well, that's not good for the environment. The better environmental decision is to live at lower density. And generally what we see is that that's not the case when it comes to many issues, whether it be water quality or transportation, where people living in and around designated downtowns and village centers and our designated neighborhood development areas are traveling much, much less than people living, for instance, in the exurbs of Chittenden County. So that leads to less greenhouse gas emissions. It means better health with more convenient walks to daily destinations. It's just one of the many benefits of smart growth. Another principle is strong agriculture and forestry, is to strengthen those industries and minimize conflicts with the development of these industries by focusing on development in and around centers. So when we develop in compact centers, we're reducing pressure on working farms and forests and our open landscape. And near and dear to my heart as a volunteer city councilor is that it balances growth with the availability of public services and utilities. And this matters in the same image because infrastructure is a shared cost. Not all land uses that I've pointed out yield the same in tax dollars under our property tax structures. A single family dwelling lot, residential lot, almost always yields less than per acre than a multi-family dwelling on a small lot. And here you can just see an example. This is Arlington in this case. 15 homes, 150 feet of street frontage on 0.2 acres, $941,000 an acre per tax. On the other example, I can't quite see it, but you can see it's 18 homes, 1 mile road, 2 acre lots, much less tax revenue per acre, per linear foot of street that it takes to support that development. Next slide. Taking over a suite of services, whether it be providing school busing services or water lines or EMTs, that adds up to a lot of savings. And the cost to really service spread out homes is much more expensive on the community as a whole than it is when we achieve that goal of compact settlement. Next slide. And so if you live in a low density area, this is an opportunity to think about how you can thank a landlord or a tenant or somebody who's building in a compact settlement, because these are some of the most economically productive parcels. And this is the region. You can see Bennington and Arlington and Manchester. The greener areas are some of the highest value property in the region. And of course, having homes in and around businesses supports diverse business centers, and it supports the viability of business. And that's a smart growth principle. And most relevant to today's smart growth principles is the next slide. Diverse housing, and that's about providing housing that meets a variety of needs. It meets people where they are, and that means we need a variety of housing types. And you've heard a little bit us talk about density today, and that can mean more density than we have, a need for more density than may be allowed today. And just an example of what, in the next slide, of what that can achieve. In this multi-unit dwelling, same exercise, but this is a building in Winooski on 0.77 acres, 57 units, valued at about $8 million per acre. And that's a tremendous benefit to any community. And one thing that I think that is important to focus on is that we're seeing a lot of single-family home development, and we have a lot of multi-family development. But there's a tremendous opportunity to develop more missing middle housing. And it's really kind of the new old way of Vermont historic and compact settlements. It's about duplexes and triplexes and fourplexes, looking at cottage cluster development, multiplex and live-work units. And this is an area of focus, not only as a middle income housing option, but also as a built form housing option, that there are opportunities between the single family dwelling and a 30 and 40 unit building within a downtown, particularly in rural communities that may not have water or sewer service. And so just an example of, how can incremental infill, what could that look like? I hear a lot of people say, well, we're built out. There's no opportunities for infill. And I would challenge you, on almost any neighborhood, there tend to be opportunities for infill if you look for them, and the local zoning regulations enable that infill to occur. So this is an example of a street in Winooski, and thinking about if the local zoning bylaws allowed it, what some potential infill could look like. These are what type of housing types could fit in in a space that's already served by water, that's already served by bus, that's walkable to commerce and schools and a library. These are the opportunities that we're focusing on in the Department of Housing and Community Development, and we're challenging communities to really think about in a more deliberate way, especially those housing ambassadors that VHFA is focused on. One thing the smart growth principles also say is what it's not. It's not excessively land consumptive. It's not limiting of transportation options. It doesn't fragment farms and forests. It doesn't require extensions of utilities across undeveloped land, and it's not highway strip development. Some of those developments that can initially feel cheap, they can tend to carry costs with them over the long run, and that's really what smart growth is about, is thinking about those long-term costs for both households and communities, and making and putting homes in the smartest places we can. So the question we've been asking a lot at the department is, what are the biggest little changes both at the state and at communities can make to improve smart housing access and affordability in your community? And one step I hope you'll take today is to subscribe to the Strong Communities Quarterly. This is a fantastic newsletter the Community Planning and Revitalization Division puts together each quarter. It talks about our designation programs, all of which could be an individual presentation. These designation programs, downtowns, villages, new town centers, growth centers, neighborhood development areas, they unlock opportunities to access tax credits in support of housing. They extend regulatory incentives like a priority housing project exemption for mixed income housing projects from Act 250. Even if you're in Act 250, a 50% fee reduction for projects that might be going through Act 250. So there are a lot of great incentives attached to these designations, and it's worth talking to your regional planners about and us to learn if your designations if you're making the most of the designation. If you don't have one, what you can do to achieve a designation. There's also granting prioritization and funding, including the Downtown Transportation Plan, municipal planning grants, and resources such as our municipal planning manual and the Enabling Better Places Guide that Jim's going to talk a little bit about how they've rolled that out in Bennington County. And I'll just give two plugs for the grant programs that we have available with deadlines coming up. There's one coming up on November 1st. The 30-year municipal planning grant program is a flexible source of funding for all types of planning projects in support of smart growth and the statewide housing goals. There's $500,000 to award. They're regionally allocated. You can apply for up to $22,000 in an individual municipality or $35,000 working together with multiple municipalities. It's just a 10% cash match, and you have 18 months to complete the project. The other new one-time funding opportunity on the next slide is bylaw modernization grants. So there's an additional $500,000 to award this year. The deadline is 2 weeks after. And the max grants are $25,000 for one town, or you can collaborate across communities. And I hear there are a lot of communities in Bennington County talking about working together to make the most of this grant program, which has extra time to complete. And of course, there's more information available on the agency's website. We have a lot of materials in the back of the room on municipal planning grants, bylaw modernization grants, as well as the Enabling Better Places Guide that Jim's going to talk about. So.
Well, thank you, Jacob. That's a great overview of smart growth principles. And again, my name is Jim Sullivan. I'm the director of the Bennington County Regional Commission. I've been working in planning and land use policy in Bennington County for 35 years now, which may lead to the question of why haven't I figured this out yet and solved the problems. We're still working on it. So I'm going to, this says updating municipal housing regulations. This is basically a presentation that we gave a while back based on the guide that Jacob referenced that the department put together with some partners. this past year. And I'm really, again, presenting this from the perspective of the municipality. There's so many things that go into, as we've heard and will heard, the cost and availability of housing. But if you don't get the framework right at the municipal land use policy and regulatory level, the rest of this stuff just isn't going to work, and it isn't going to fall into place. So I'm going to talk about that, and I wanted to start just by briefly reflecting on how things maybe got to the point where they are now. Historically, if you look back, an awful lot of land use regulation at both the state and the municipal level really came in a big flood back in the late 60s, early 70s, where there was a lot of new development pressure in the state, and there weren't a lot of environmental regulations in place to control that. So a lot of these land use regulations were put in place in a very conservative and restrictive way, actually, to try to affect some of these very important and legitimate environmental concerns. But some of those things, now that environmental regulations at the state level have really advanced significantly, a lot of the stuff that's left in municipal regulations are kind of artifacts of the past, and they can get in the way of good planning and regulation now. So we're going to talk about some of that. The other big thing that was going on at the time when these regulations were first put into place was something that really hasn't fully gone away yet, but we're starting to grapple with it, and that is the American fascination with the personal automobile. And we did an awful lot of our planning based around making life easier for cars instead of people. And so I think we continue to kind of struggle with a couple of those things, and we'll see that in some of the examples here. The types of places and the context is really important. No two towns, no two villages are the same. So Bennington isn't Manchester, Dorset isn't Shaftesbury, and so the context of those communities really has to be recognized and considered in our town plans and our village plans and our implementing regulations. And we're focusing in a lot of this bylaw modernization work that Jacob referenced, and in trying to implement the smart growth principles that he was talking about, we're really focusing a lot of our efforts on the downtowns, the village centers, and the surrounding neighborhoods, where we're really trying to encourage most of that development to occur. So that's just a couple. By the way, I borrowed most of these images from this very excellent guide. So downtowns and village centers, again, we don't have a lot of downtowns in our region. We've got Bennington and Manchester, and both of those communities have done a lot of work addressing progressive changes to their regulations in those areas. Village centers is a huge issue for us. I mean, we're sitting in one right here now where, in Arlington Village Center, there's East Arlington Village Center, a lot of village centers where there's tremendous untapped potential for new housing development, and we'll look at some of those issues. Next slide. Neighborhoods, I don't know if that's a great neighborhood picture, but I think we can all identify areas just outside of village centers, just outside of downtowns, where there's existing development and potential for a lot more infill development. Next. In these neighborhoods we're talking about, really talking about areas that we'd like to be walkable, places where you can move between your residential neighborhoods and the village centers. In Arlington, we spent some time years ago, one of the projects I worked on was just building a sidewalk between Arlington and East Arlington Village that also connected a bunch of those residential neighborhoods. So if you just think about the Arlington context, you can picture what some of those neighborhoods are like, and you can probably picture where some of the potential is for additional development that would be in keeping with the character of the community. Next slide. So these are some of the things. I'm just going to go through these quickly, and again, there's resources through the Regional Planning Commission, through Jacob's department, And again, this Enabling Better Places guide has some really nice tables that can actually like serve as templates and examples for the types of regulations that really work well to encourage the type of smart growth development Jacob's talking about. Next. So dimensional requirements. These are some of the things that are pointed out in the guide, and some of the things that we look at now, first and foremost when we start working with towns and villages on their regulatory changes. First thing is to match the dimensional requirements to existing conditions. And that top image is one example of an analysis that was done by the BCRC in Dorset. And we've, since working with UVM interns, we've actually done similar analysis for most of the village centers in the region, just looking at how the existing development pattern in those areas compare with what the zoning standards are. And you find a somewhat disturbing level of nonconformity existing in those places, which basically means if you really like those places and the way they look, you couldn't even replicate them using the existing standards because they're so restrictive that they push development out. So there's a disconnect between the land use plans and the municipal plans and the purpose sections of a lot of the zoning bylaws and the actual dimensional requirements. The second one is a real big one, and it's another one of those, it's one of the principal ones, it's an artifact of those earlier environmental regulations, I think, or lack of environmental regulations. And that is an awful lot of our, especially in our smaller towns, the density requirements for development are based on per unit of housing or per principal use in a building. So for example, like, take a look at that bottom picture. If say there's a general store on the first floor and a couple of apartments upstairs on a half-acre lot, and say there's a half-acre minimum lot size in that village district, a lot of our old bylaws would say you need to have half-acre for each housing unit and for the retail unit, which means you need an acre and a half of land to put that one building on. In the middle of a village, it makes no sense. It doesn't work. I mean, we still have those issues. I'll talk a little bit more about later with, well, it might not work anyway if you don't have municipal infrastructure, water and sewer. But that should be more of the controlling factor than just a blanket restriction on lot size or acreage requirement. It should be those now existing environmental regulations. You can permit secondary buildings. Some of historic districts notwithstanding, I understand that they often have to have fairly specific requirements to preserve the historic character of an area, but sometimes some of the architectural requirements get a little bit overboard. If we look at the stuff that's really important, that really makes villages work, it's more the location of the building on a lot. Is the principal building up close to the road? Does it have porches and windows? Is the parking in back instead of in front? Beyond that, a lot of the stuff, boy, if you look at it, it doesn't matter that much. And so we try to get away from being overly restrictive in that area. And next slide. Parking standards. Again, we used to plan and design everything for cars, right? And we see some of the consequences of that now. This map is from an analysis the Regional Commission did of the center of Bennington, looked at a few years ago, of how much of the land area is occupied by paved parking areas versus other uses, including buildings and green space. And honestly, almost half of the area is paved parking area downtown Bennington. And that's not really a great value add to the community. It's not really the kind of place where you want to move about. You want to find a place to put your car and leave it there and really focus on the things that really contribute to community life. So, again, we're looking at wherever we can to right-size the parking requirements, to make sure that parking is available on street, that shared parking is enabled by the regulations. And I find it's really interesting, especially in our downtowns and village centers, to look very specifically at opportunities in development applications for ensuring that public transit opportunities exist, and that there's good bicycle and pedestrian connections, and that bike parking exists. And you can find that you can actually get away from a lot of parking, on-site parking, if you kind of take a mix of all those things, and you can increase the amount of space you have in buildings, and then thus potentially in housing, if you don't dedicate so much land to empty parking. Next. Street standards, it's one that's not so much of a zoning issue, but it's really important to making these communities work and to making housing really attractive in these downtown areas, to try to, again, make sure that the street design and landscape and the streetscape really works for people, to encourage safe pedestrian movements and street crossings, to take advantage of opportunities whenever there's a new highway project, whether it's a state project or a municipal project, to implement so-called complete streets principles, where other users of the system are considered, and that street scape between buildings is really considered an important public space for people, not just for moving cars and trucks around. And it's important to have a good working relationship with the Agency of Transportation on that. I'm still working on that myself. So again, that just recognizing that public space is really an integral part of the living environment where folks live in the center of the communities. Next. Allowable uses. Again, this is a really important one too. I think recognizing that taking maximum advantage of building space to maximize housing opportunity is really important. So, make sure that those multifamily housing is available in our community centers. There are a few examples, the pictures I'll show in just a minute. Mixed uses are, really so important. If you've just got a building that's a single-use commercial building in the middle of a village center, there's probably a lost opportunity there, because very often there's not so much interest in having commercial uses on the second floor, but if you've got a second floor and a third floor, that's a great opportunity, as Jacob showed in his statistics, to add housing right there in the middle of the town on the same footprint, and greatly increase the value of that property and opportunities for housing. So it's so important that municipal regulations allow and enable mixed-use housing in as flexible a way as possible. Next. There's been some discussion of accessory dwelling units. Those are required now in municipal zoning regulations for the last number of years. There's an ability for municipalities to be a little bit more liberal in their treatment of how accessory dwelling units are considered. It's basically, someone saw a mother-in-law apartment, but it can really be considered, as another way to do a secondary housing unit on a property, whether it's within the principal residential building or in an accessory building. And I think that I think the statute still might talk about like 30% or something. They put in some number of the floor area to be dedicated to accessory dwelling units, but municipalities can tweak that number to make it a little bit more easier for folks to work with. And one of the really significant things is, a lot of people as they get older, they might want to stay in their house, but they don't need the larger portion of the house for themselves. So as long as if the property owner can actually move into the accessory dwelling unit and rent out the rest of the property, that can be a real workable solution too. Next. The development review process is That must be my timer. Is that telling me I got to wrap it up soon? The development review process is pretty significant too. I've been kind of crusading the last few years against the proliferation of conditional uses. Is it like a lot of people are like, when they were putting their zoning regulations together and they were a little bit nervous about a particular use, and it might be multifamily housing or it might be types of mixed-use development, they say, I don't know, we kind of want it, but we're not, so we'll make it a conditional use. And that conditional use criteria brings in some certain level of subjectivity and uncertainty for developers or property owners. And I think it's so much better to just say, hey, this is what we want. It's a permitted use. Here's some very clear standards about how we want it built. If you build it that way, it's permitted. Don't worry about these other conditional use standards. Let's see, another critical one there. Allow for some specific, deviations. You can't consider everything in your bylaws, so make some allowances for some deviations from the standards without getting messed up into a really tricky and almost impossible variance process. And one of the things that, again, historical artifact is these unbuildable areas of lots that were great for civil engineers who get to run around and identify all these little areas of lots that have steep slopes or soils that are unsuitable for development for one reason or another. Those things really, really complicate the development process. They limit the potential density that you can get on a lot, and there's ways to get around those too. And as was mentioned earlier, and I got a panel at the planning conference tomorrow that I'm talking about this, but a lot of these things that we're talking about, these higher densities and mixed uses, they're great ideas and they're aspirational planning goals and objectives, but they're impossible without municipal infrastructure, especially water and really especially wastewater infrastructure. And so many of our village centers have either inadequate or non-existent infrastructure that really needs to be expanded. And somebody put it the other day, he said, for so long we've been talking about financing these things, but $2 or $3 million financing for a small town is one of the reasons that we haven't seen these things happening. We need to be talking about funding these things, and making these things much more accessible for some of our smaller communities with potentially vibrant village centers. Next. So this is a really quick overview of some of the missing middle residential types that some of our land use regulations have prevented, but which really shouldn't be, because you see they're really not offensive things. This is like potential accessory dwelling unit. There's a dwelling unit over that garage in the back. Does that really change the character or how this thing works or functions? No, and it provides a very attractive second dwelling unit on the lot. A duplex, again, a duplex and a triplex. So there are a lot of houses. Boy, I drive around our region. Some of our communities in the center, they're these big old rambling houses, and it's very difficult to maintain them or for people to buy them because they're so large. But if they could be converted into a duplex or a triplex or a multifamily home, they not only provide more housing, but they also make it much more possible for the owner of the property to maintain it properly over time. Trying to maintain a 4,000, 5,000 square foot house as a single family home when you just don't need that, but you're not allowed to develop it because of regulatory reasons is a real barrier. I think there was like one picture or two pictures in this manual from our region, so that was one, so I had to put it in that. But that's some row housing, I believe, along Vermont Avenue in Bennington, and shout out to Shires Housing, who I have a long-standing relationship with. But they did a really nice redevelopment project in some of those townhouses, and I think I'm very proud of all the Shires Housing projects, but I think that one probably got more praise from people in the community than any other one. But converting that type of old, mill factory housing into multi-family housing is really a tremendous opportunity for a lot of communities. Next. This one was from the guide too, and I was like, wow, yeah. I forget how many units they said in that building, and I said, I see some issues and problems with this particular property, but not least of which is I'm afraid that chimney might fall through somebody's apartment. But some of these big old houses, if you can pick up, 6 or 8 units of housing in the center of town by doing a conversion, and certainly it takes some money to do that, but it's definitely a way to reinforce the density and the focus on housing in existing established areas. And I guess I was leaving it with this. This is, like I said, this is a really good guide, and I wanted to emphasize what Jacob said. We have used this and principles in this for doing a lot of our bylaw work with municipalities, and we have reached out to all the towns and villages in our region regarding the bylaw modernization initiative, and have specifically identified 10 of our 17 municipalities to hopefully work together in a consortium application to do bylaw modernization work that would incorporate a lot of these principles over the next couple of years. And I think that regional planning commissions around the state are probably doing very similar things. We really focus on those towns that haven't received that level of attention. Manchester and Bennington have done recent regulatory work. Janet's going to talk, I think, about the Manchester case recently, and they've really got out ahead of the game, but a lot of our towns still need that modernization work. So it's a great timing for that grant program, so thank you.
Let's take one. Does somebody have a question? Bill.
Better be a good one, Bill.
Yeah.
One question.
Okay.
One thing you seem to sidestep here is there seems to be a conflict that we have a propensity in Vermont, particularly in village centers, of just because it's old, we have to preserve it. And quite often in building affordable housing, it's, let's say, more desirable or economically viable to remove an old building and then do multiple smaller units clustered on the typical half-acre to 3/4 acre lots that exist in village centers. And I've experienced that in just a development that I had to fight with Act 250 to remove an old house that happened to be on the register, but was just not recyclable in any way. How do you deal with those issues?
Well, Jacob, maybe from a broader perspective, but yeah, I recognize that that's an issue, and it's an issue at the state permitting level. I'll talk briefly about it just from a municipal level, because there is a sense in a lot of municipalities that the existing development pattern and the existing house type of some of those older homes they have established the character of the community, and that shouldn't be changed, So trying to find ways to encourage compatible infill development, or to find ways to convince towns that it's appropriate to allow the conversion of those houses into multi-family dwellings, or to add additional buildings on the lot. It's a discussion that really has to happen at the town level, and I think examples need to be shown so you can maintain the character of the community while making those types of changes. Now, you're talking specifically, Bill, about old houses that would be prohibitively expensive to renovate and turn into new housing, and it would be much easier to develop new housing. And I totally appreciate that and recognize that. A lot of the housing stuff that Shires has done, we've certainly seen that it's a lot easier and less expensive to build new than to try to work with those old houses. And so I think it's a constant balancing between preservation and housing, and I think it's maybe one of the things that we need to look at from a state perspective from historic preservation is like maybe the scales need to tip a little bit back more toward encouraging new affordable housing.
I have one question. When we're talking about smart growth, and so much of Vermont is so rural, you kind of touched on this, but only 40 some odd communities have municipal sewer systems. How do you achieve smart growth in a town that doesn't have that kind of infill development, a lot of housing on small plots of land, if you don't have a true municipal wastewater system? Is there a way to still do it?
Well, I think so. Some of the things, and this is a tool that's not deeply addressed in the Enabling Better Places Guide, but if you look at a typical zoning center, our village center zoning district, there will be minimum lot sizes that we'll probably put in place, as Jim said before, we had the state water wastewater permit. And those minimum lot sizes, it can make it quite difficult, and in conjunction with the allowed uses, like whether it's a single family home or a duplex, can make it hard to cluster those homes and then do a community septic just for an individual development. So I would say that there are opportunities to look at your zoning code to say, how can we do this without a community septic system? Could we put a planned unit development in place that would allow some clustering and a shared septic or a shared well, or use of a water district and a shared septic system?
Yeah, and I think, the bottom line, Seth, is it's really hard. You need some type of infrastructure. But I think a lot of times people think about wastewater systems, like the last one that was built in our region was the one in Pownell, which is more of a traditional big EPA project, with main sewer lines and big treatment plants. And there are a lot of opportunities now with real innovative designs for smaller scale wastewater solutions that can allow and encourage the kind of infill development we're talking about. In a village center, it can maybe allow for a couple of commercial uses and 20, 30 new units of housing that wouldn't be possible without it. And if you add all that together, it's a significant amount. The problem is those things are still expensive. And there's a program in the Agency of Natural Resources, a village wastewater program, that kind of sets out a course, and I think it's probably going to be supplemented by some more infrastructure money. But it sets a course for how you do the planning study and how you roll that into ultimately a community wastewater solution. And shout out to Arlington here, who years ago did an innovative wastewater solution up at the schools, and now with some additional capacity and some work that Nick's doing with the town, they're working on ways to change the outlet so that can accommodate some additional development in town. But that's the kind of small innovative solution that most of our villages really need, frankly.
And we're actually going to hear from Nick in the next panel. So it is 10 after.